Okay, so let's start with a really interesting question. Have you ever wondered if your own mind would work differently if you were born in another time, or even just another place? Today, we're diving into how culture doesn't just influence our thoughts, it can actually fundamentally shape the experience of a complex condition like schizophrenia. We tend to think of mental illness as this fixed biological fact, something that's all about brain chemistry. But what if it's not that simple? This question right here, it really challenges that whole idea. It suggests that the way an illness is actually experienced isn't just about what's happening in our brains, but about the world we live in, our culture, and our deepest beliefs.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start by looking at how researchers even study this stuff. Then we'll take a trip around the world to see some symptoms that might really surprise you. We'll even time travel a bit to see how delusions have changed, uncover some truly unique syndromes, and then at the end, we'll tie it all together to see why this way of looking at mental health is so incredibly important. All right, first things first. Where do you even start when you're trying to untangle the link between our minds and our culture? Well, scientists have a few key ways they approach this puzzle. So, researchers can do things like compare how common the illness is in different places, or see how culture might affect someone's risk of developing it. But for us, today, we're going to zero in on the last two, because this is where things get really fascinating. We're talking about how culture literally molds the symptoms a person feels, and how it can even create unique conditions you just won't find anywhere else. Okay, let's get into it. We're going to start our world tour to see just how differently this one illness can show up depending on where you are on the map. A huge global study found some pretty mind-blowing differences. For example, in many African countries, it's more common to have visual and tactile hallucinations, seeing or feeling things, and delusions often center on magic, like being bewitched. But then you go to Asia, and you're more likely to see things like social withdrawal, delusions of jealousy, or even catatonia, which is this state where someone becomes unresponsive, almost like they're frozen in place. And then in Ethiopia, patients often have delusions with powerful religious themes, like they're on a messianic mission, but they're also generally found to be less aggressive than patients in Europe. And this leads to an absolutely fascinating point. What a person's delusion is about isn't just random. It's pulled straight from the anxieties, the beliefs, and yeah, even the technology of the world around them. This shows the evolution perfectly. I mean, think about it. In Western countries, delusions about being cursed by a witch or possessed by a demon have mostly faded away. And what replaced them? Fears rooted in modern tech, believing your thoughts are being controlled by radio waves or that the government is listening in through wiretaps and radar. The deep down fear of persecution might be the same, but the language it uses is totally contemporary. And hey, this isn't just a Western thing. A major study in Japan looked at patient records over decades and found this incredible drop in specific delusions, like the feeling of being possessed or this thing called micromania, which is the totally bizarre belief that your own body is shrinking. As Japanese culture changed, so did the content of its people's deepest anxieties. Okay, so this brings us to our next stop. Some syndromes are so deeply tangled up in a specific cultural context that you almost never see them anywhere else in the world. Okay, check this out. Buffet daily rot. It's a term from French psychiatry for a really sudden, intense, but short-lived delusional episode. But in a place like Haiti, it can have a very specific flavor, often involving these vivid feelings of being possessed by a spirit, which ties directly into local voodoo beliefs. Now, in the US, a doctor would probably just call this an acute episode of schizophrenia, and that entire cultural meaning would be lost. Now, I want you to really, truly imagine that for a second. Looking at someone you love more than anything and being absolutely certain they're a fake. This deeply unsettling feeling is the absolute core of another, even stranger syndrome. It's called Capgras syndrome, and it's just as strange as it sounds. The person is 100% convinced that a loved one, their mother, their partner, has been replaced by a perfect, identical-looking imposter, a double. They look right, they sound right, but the patient knows deep in their bones that it's not the real person. So how in the world could a belief like that even happen? Well, one psychoanalytic theory has a really powerful explanation. The idea is the patient has these deep, conflicting feelings of love and hate for someone close to them, but the guilt of feeling that hate is just too much to handle. So the mind does this incredible trick. It basically splits the person in two. The real loved person is kept safe, and all those negative, hateful feelings get projected onto this imposter, who can be hated without any of the guilt. All right, for a last example, let's head over to Malaya and look at a syndrome called Lata. What's so interesting is that in its own culture, it's often not even seen as a disease, but more like a strange personal quirk. And it can all start with something as simple as being suddenly startled, like by stepping on a snake.
And the symptoms that follow are, well, they're just wild. Sufferers might find themselves uncontrollably repeating everything you say. That's called echolalia. Or they might perfectly copy your every move. That's agopraxia. They might even start shouting obscene words they would never, ever normally use. It's like this total involuntary surrender of their own will to the people and words around them.
So, after seeing all these examples, from delusions about government wiretaps to believing your mom is an imposter, we have to ask the big question. So what? What does this all really mean?
Well, here's the bottom line. We just can't fully understand the mind without understanding the world that it lives in. Mental illness isn't some simple thing that's just about biology. It's a profoundly human experience. It's a story. And the plot points of that story are drawn from the culture, the technology, and the beliefs that surround us all.
So, what you should really take away from all this is that a psychiatric diagnosis is never just a simple label. It's more like a snapshot, one that captures not only a person's inner world, but the larger world that they're a part of. Because when it comes right down to it, our minds and our cultures are completely and beautifully inseparable. And that leaves us with one last really powerful question to think about. If a culture provides the very language and the very shape of an illness, what role could it and what role should it play in helping us heal?